Okay, thank you, Rabbi Kelman. Yes, it was last minute, but thank God we're, so to speak, off, not yet back into the regular, whatchamacallit, schedule, so we have a little bit more flexibility. Um, and so to speak, Bein Hazmanim, but after the break, after the summer break, and back, but right before the in-service and all the other things start and shul stuff starts. Um, Rabbi Kelvin, can you just share me?
I made you co-host. Yeah,
Okay, great. So I can share.
yeah,
Okay,
absolutely. Yeah.
okay. Erev Tov to everybody. So this evening I wanted to speak about the Parshat Re'eh, and specifically I wanted to first spend the first half, maybe two-thirds of this year, focusing on the place of Parshat Re'eh in the whole scheme of Sefer Dvarim and what specifically it comes to contribute to Sefer Dvarim and part of the essential message of Sefer Dvarim as it emerges. And if we have time, we'll also talk about some specific passages in Parshat Re'eh, and we'll see how far we get. Okay, so I wanted to speak a little bit about the general scheme of Sefer Dvarim. Again, I don't know who's spoken about it in the past, so please, I'm sorry if any of what I'm about to say is repetitive of anybody else, but it's also good chazara. It's good repeating something, at least for me, is a good way of making sure that it stays in my brain. Okay, so if we look at the book of Deuteronomy, if we look at Sefer Dvarim, um, so we'll see, of course, it's a book. Let me get rid of my face. Okay, it's a book that has it has 34 chapters. And if we look at the book in its totality, we'll notice a couple of things. We notice that um, it divides itself, the book in general, into a number of major units. Chapter one, two, and three, what we call Parshat Dvarim, are very much a selected history, um, the speeches of Moshe Rabbeinu, which focus on specific events from the past, especially the Meraglim and other events that Moses wants them to, so to speak, take lessons from for the future. And so the first Ne'um, the first speech, really goes through starts with Eile Hadvarim Asher Diber Moshe El Kol Yisrael, Be'ever HaYarden, and it has what we would call a didactic history, a selective didactic history trying to teach the people certain lessons, certain messages that they're supposed to take with them. Once we get to chapter 5, um, we start to move from what we would call history or didactic history, Musar, in terms of learning what we would say um, from the past, and we start to begin to talk about the chukim and the mishpatim. We start to talk about the mitzvot, which is one of the reasons why, and the main reason why this book has another nickname in Chazal, Mishneh Torah, the repetition or reciting the teaching of the Torah, Mishneh Torah, and that is the major speech, which on one level, uh, one could say goes from chapter 5 through chapter 26. Because if you look at various chapters, just again at random, for example, if you look at chapter 7, so you have mitzvot like don't make a covenant with the nations of the world that are living in the land of Israel. Ki asiret bincha mi'acharai. They're going to uh, move you away from God, and you're going to worship avodah zarah. So it talks about that. Then if I randomly, let's say, go into the middle of our Parsha, Parshat Re'eh, we also have a lot of mitzvot. We have the Shemitah, the mitzvah of the sabbatical. We have the mitzvah of tzedakah, patoach tiftach et yadecha, naton titain lo. We have the mitzvot of Bechor. We get to chapter 19, we talk about uh, the mitzvot of what do we do of setting up the system for the Rotseach, what we call the Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge. We have all kinds of mitzvot. And then we go to chapter 22, just at random. We have mitzvot like if you see a shore, if you see the ox of your friend, and it's lost. Hashev teshivim la'achicha. This is the mitzvah of Hashavar Aveda. So we have a whole slew of mitzvot. So basically, from chapter 5 through chapter 26, which concludes the section of mitzvot, we have which with the bikurim and maaser, we have what we call ne'um mitzvot. So if chapter 1 through 4 is the speech which Moshe gave, focusing on history and specifically what historical events you're supposed to take with you and internalize so that you come into the land of Israel and don't be afraid, etc., etc. Chapter 5 through chapter 26 is the Ne'um HaMitzvot. It is the uh, speech that focuses on the mitzvot. From chapter 27 on, we have the third section, which is basically about concretizing this revelation, the second revelation that Moshe Rabbeinu, recounting the mitzvot, which we call in broad terms Brit Arvot Moav. This is the Brit that was recounted as the beginning of the book says, Moshe Hayardain, on the other side of the Jordan, Bamidbar, etc., etc., and Be'ever Hayardain Be'eretz Moav, in the territory of Moab. Specifically, this is called Arvot Moav. This is where they were. So from chapter 27 through chapter 28, through chapter 29, 30, 31, are all what we would say are the Brit, the covenant, that these mitzvot are part of a covenantal relationship with God. And so there's a series of covenantal events, we would call them, bringing the Jewish people, telling them that you're going to go into the land of Israel and you're going to set yourself up and you're going to go onto two mountains. Takimu ta'avanim eile bahar eval, and then it talks about Eila Ya'amdu Livarechatam al Har Grizim. So you have the Har Eval and Har Grizim. You have the two mountains where, so to speak, whether you're cursed or you're blessed. And of course, the entire section of the Tochacha, of the reproof, which concludes with the statement, Eile divrei habrit, asher tziva Hashem et Moshe lichrot Yisrael be'eretz Moav milvad habrit asher karat. These are the words of the covenant that Moses established with the people, in addition to the covenant at Sinai. These words, this pasuk, as many people, as the Ramban and others point out, is not just a reference to chapter 28. It's a reference to the entire series of mitzvot. Eile divrei habrit. These are the words of the brit that you should keep, and if you don't keep them, there's going to be consequences. Chapter 29, 30, and 31 are really continuations of that. Parshat Nitzavim and Parshat Vayelech are telling us what happens if you don't keep the brit that God is setting you up for. we have the Parsha, we have Vayelech, and of course, that's the third section. So this little section from chapter 26 through 31. And then, and you could also throw in 32, Ha'azinu is a speech which deals with that, with what are the consequences of not keeping the Brit and what's going to happen in the future. And even though the Jewish people are going to rebel, God will step in because of God's name that is defiled. And then, of course, the fourth section, we would say, is the closing of the book, which is the brachot of Moshe, what we call the Zota Bracha, and the death of Moshe at the very end of the book. So that's the general division of the book, as already was noted in 100 and I don't know 30, 40 years ago by Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman in his groundbreaking commentary on Sefer Dvarim. But if we get a little bit more close and we analyze, we actually have to divide the Ne'um HaMitzvot, the section of the mitzvot, and we actually see that the Ne'um HaMitzvot actually divides itself into two major units. Um, I think I saw there was something, a chat, somebody asked something. Is there a bilingual version of this source sheet? Um, I'm just sharing, it's not a source sheet, I'm just sharing from a website. You can use any website. You want to use Safaria to look up a Hebrew English. You can do like that. It's just easier in terms of the text. So when we look at the actual mitzvot, starting in chapter 5, going through chapter 26 in the book of Deuteronomy, we actually find that it's not the same flavor. What do I mean by that? So we'll notice, for example, if I take chapter 5, for example, chapter 5 has the 10 commandments, more correctly, the 10 statements, Aseret HaDibrot. And it tells us the story of the 10 commandments. And makes sense if I'm going to start talking about the mitzvot. So I go back to the original covenant that God made with the Jewish people, where he presented the foundational mitzvot of the 10 commandments, the 10 statements. But then I look at something, let's say chapter 8. So I look at chapter 8, and God says, Kol ha-mitzvah asher anochi mitzavcha hayom tishmerun lasot. All the mitzvah that I'm teaching you, be careful and keep it. And you should remember what happened when you were in the desert, that God tested you, and God provided the man, and God took care of you, and God is bringing you to the land of Israel. And what is the mitzvah? So today we associate this mitzvah with Birkat HaMazon, but on a pshat level, on a plain sense level, it's not about specifically, it's describing what's going to happen when the Jews come to the land of Israel. And they're going to enjoy the land of Israel. Eretz Asher Avanei Barzel, Me'er Tachtzov Nechoshet. You're going to be able to hew out beautiful things. V'achalta v'savata, you will eat. Uveirachta et Hashem Elokecha. This is not necessarily a mitzvah. It's not formulated on a pshat level as a, do this, do that. It's much more, this is what's naturally going to occur. You're going to eat, you're going to enjoy, and you're going to feel thanksgiving to God. But be careful as you get settled there. Hishamer lecha pen tishkach et Hashem Elokecha, lest you forget the Lord your God. L'vil tishmor mitzvotav, and you'll start to think, Viram levavcha, your heart will will become haughty, etc., etc. And you'll forget God. And the same thing when you look in chapter 9 or chapter 10, uh, the mitzvot are that are mentioned here are, talk about you're coming into the land of Israel. Don't be afraid. Don't think that I'm better than the Goyim, but rather God has decided to bring you here. And as a proof that you're not so great, remember that you sinned at in the sin of the golden calf. That's what chapter 9 is all about. And then we get to chapter 11, right before our parsha, and again, we have, you know, remember the land you're coming into is not the same as Mitzrayim, and it's not the same, and make sure to keep if you don't listen to the covenant, God will exile you. And the mitzvot that we are familiar with from the Shema, the second paragraph of the Shema here, are these mitzvot, again, on a Peshat level, on a plain sense level. You should put all these ideas in your heart. Ukshartem otam lo tayetchem, remember them and write them on the doorposts. And make sure that you don't forget God. That's chapters 5, 6, 7, 8. When I get to, let's say, our parsha, so I have like Perek Yudalit. If I look in the middle of Parshat Re'eh, so I have kashrut. I have the laws, lo tochal kol toeva, don't eat anything that is an abomination, etc., etc. You should eat. These are the fish you can eat, and these are the birds you can eat. Kol tzipor Torah tochelu, and these are the birds that you can't eat. It talks about maaser, all these things. It talks about tithing. It talks about tzedakah. It talks about shmita. That's Parshat Re'eh. It talks about the holidays. It talks about the holidays at the end of Parshat Re'eh. And this is all in Parshat Re'eh. When we get to the next Parsha, so it talks about, you know, this is, make sure that you don't turn to sorcery, but rather you should turn to the prophets. Um, it talks about in chapter 18, in chapter 17, it talks about when you want to you have to set up a monarchy. This is the laws of how you set up a monarchy. And then we go to the next parsha, Parshat Kitetse, and we have all these laws about how with Loti, about Hashavat Aveda, and all kinds of technical laws, etc., marriage laws, divorce laws, laws regarding if a woman was taken advantage of, etc., etc. Till it finally concludes in chapter 24. It talks about the laws of marriage again, talks about who goes into, etc. So you have a very different flavor when you start in our parsha, Parshat Re'eh, as opposed to chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Meaning, as opposed to Parshat Va'et Hanan and Parshat Ekev, the last two parshiot that we've been reading, you have a very different flavor of mitzvot. From chapter 5 through chapter 11, the mitzvot are very, what we would call klaliot. They're very generic, very general, excuse me. They're very general. They're foundational. Just to give you an example, um, I'll get back to this in a second, but like it talks about, don't forget God, et Hashem Elokecha tira, oto ta'avod, you shall have reverence for the Lord your God, and you should worship God. Lo telchu nacharei Elohim achirim, don't follow other gods. Don't test God. When your child asks you, and this, of course, is famous because we incorporate it in as part of the Midrash in the Haggadah. Ki shalcha bincha machar lemor ma ha'edot v'chukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu ad. Right? If your child is going to ask you, what is the purpose of all these mitzvot? You have to give them a historical background. From chapter 5 through chapter 11, we basically have what we would call the foundational understructure, superstructure of the entire Brit, of the entire covenant. So chapter 5, 6, 7, 8 deals with these very general mitzvot. And it's not by chance, interestingly enough, just to give you an insight into the genius of Chazal. So if you look in chapter 5, right, for example, so if we turn to chapter 5, so chapter 5 begins, as I said, with the entire Shema Yisrael, et hachukim ve'et hamishpatim. Listen, O Israel, to the chukim and the mishpatim, asher anochi dover be'oznechem. There's a kind of generic introduction to the mitzvot, and that God spoke to us. And it starts with the foundational mitzvah, the mitzvot of the Aseret HaDibrot. Now, it's not by chance that if you look in the Talmud says that in the temple, we don't do this anymore, but they used to, before they said Kriyat Shema, they would incorporate the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, into the Kriyat Shema. The Gemara in Brachot cites a Mishnah from Masechet Tamid, which says explicitly that this is what they used to do. Let me see if I can pull it up so that everyone can see it. Let me see if I can pull it up in my own. Let me make this a very famous statement of the Talmud. Brachot. What is it? Brachot Daf Yud Aleph. Let's see. Daf Yud Aleph? Is it Daf Yud Aleph? Let's see. Brachot Daf Yud Aleph Amud Bet. Is it Amud Bet? Let me see. Or is it even Amud Yud Bet, Amud Aleph? Or is it even Yud Bet, Amud Bet? See it. Let me see. Just a second. Apologize. It's always hard when you want to find something at the last minute. Did he die? He died. Well, that's part of giving the shear the last minute also. Yeah, that's not here, and it's yeah, it's Daf Yud Aleph Amud Bet. Let me share it again. Share my screen. Sorry. So if I share my screen more, sharing. So the Talmud says, Tanan Hatam, it's in Masechet Tamid. Amar Lahem HaMemuna, the person who was in charge of what we would today call the Gabbai. Barchu Baracha Achat. The Kohanim should recite one blessing. This is one of the earliest Mishnaic sources about what we eventually becomes what we know as standard prayer service. So in the temple, Barchu Bracha Achat, Vehem Barchu. V'karu Aseret HaDibrot, and they read the Aseret HaDibrot, Shema, the first paragraph of Shema, V'hayim Shamoa, the second paragraph of Shema, Vayomer, the third paragraph of Shema, Ubarchu et ta'am gimel brachot, and they said they blessed the people with three blessings, and this is what they did. So this was the temple. The Aseret Dibrot preceded. The Aseret Dibrot preceded um, the saying of the Shema, and it makes perfect sense because if you look in, sorry, this is the wrong. That's what happens when you have too many things open. Sorry. If you look, this was what I wanted. If you look in chapter 5, like I said, so you have the introduction. God says, listen, O Israel, to all the mitzvot I'm going to give you. Then you have the Aseret HaDibrot and the little addendum that the people heard the Aseret HaDibrot and they were frightened. And God said, Moses, you alone will, because the people are frightened, you come in and listen and you'll pass it on to them. And then we get to the beginning of chapter 6, and Moses repeats, Zota mitzvah chukim asher tzivah Hashem lamed etchem, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Right on the heels of the Aseret HaDibrot, and the fact that the people were then afraid to continue to listen directly from God, now Moses, in a sense, picks up and says, since you were not ready to hear the entirety of the covenant directly from God, I'm going to, so to speak, pick it up. And this is exactly what he's doing here as well, repeating the covenant. He sets that up. And he starts with Shema. Because if you think about it, what is Shema? Shema is basically a kind of expansion of the first two dibrot, the first two statements of the Ten Commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzeitich, I am the Lord your God. The belief in that there is God and there's one God, the God of Israel. And then in the second dibra, we talk about don't have any other gods before me. Lo tieh lecha Elohim acharim al pan, lo yeh lecha Elohim acharim al panai. Lo taseh kol pesel, don't make it, right? And God there speaks of, in chapter 5, just to get back to the Aseret HaDibrot, God speaks of, don't make, right? Make sure you believe in one God. Don't bow down to them, v'lo to'ovdeim, ki anochi Hashem Elokecha el kana poked avon avot avanim l'sonai, v'oseh chesed la'alavim lo havai, u'l'shomrei mitzvotai. But he does chesed for many, many generations to those who love the Lord and those who keep his mitzvot. This is the first time in the Bible where we have the concept of love of God. Now, what does love of God mean? So, chapter 6, what we call the Shema, it opens and starts to tell us, how do we love God? With all your heart, all your soul. And one of the ways is make sure that these words of that God has commanded you in the Aseret HaDibrot, that's the simple reading, are on your heart. Vishinamtam levanecha, teach them to your children. Ukshartam lota yadecha. These are the ways that you will ensure that you will love God. And the rest of the Parsha is an expansion of these things. So the Shema, it makes perfect sense that they would have said Aseret HaDibrot, and then they said the Shema. Parenthetically, the Talmud relates that at some point they stopped doing it. People started to do it outside of the Beit HaMikdash, and they stopped doing it, the Gemara says, because of Taromet HaMinim, because of the concern of that the Minim, the heretics, were misinterpreting it. What does that mean? Probably, as most people point out, this means with the growth of Christianity in the first and second century, second and third century of the Common Era, we know from the early writings of Christianity that one of the major themes that they believed in was that in some parts of Christian theology was that the mitzvot, most of the mitzvot were no longer applicable and no longer mandatory. And part of that was that they argued that if you look, most of the mitzvot are post the sin of the golden calf. That's the famous trope of the law as vengeance, that God punished the Jewish people by giving them the law, all these detailed laws. But the real law that God wanted was only the Ten Commandments, which he directly communicated to the Jewish people, and therefore through himself and not through Moses. And so, one of the arguments, one of the polemics that the Jewish community in the early centuries of the Common Era had to struggle with was the claim that only the Aseret HaDibrot are really important and are lechatchila, are really ideal, and the rest of the Torah, what they called secundum legislatum, secondary legislation, is really b'di'evet. It's not really something applicable and something that is important, and therefore can be especially when the new gospel comes, can be set aside. And so, therefore, they stopped doing that and giving such prominence to Aseret HaDibrot in the davening because of these polemical concerns. We know also that they found tefillin in Masada and in other places, which had the Aseret HaDibrot in the tefillin. The tefillin that we use today, halachic tefillin, do not include Aseret HaDibrot. They only include the Shema, etc. But the it makes sense. The Shema leads to the. Now, given that, we understand the first paragraph of Shema opens after we started with the Aseret HaDibrot. The first paragraph of Shema continues, and chapter 7, 8, 9 go into other foundational ideas that are relevant to the covenant. Don't forget God, even if you become very successful in the land. Don't think that you are successful because of your own power and your own. When you come into the land of Israel, don't make a covenant with the local inhabitants. Don't become assimilated. Don't marry their daughters. These are all kind of broad themed ideas. And they continue up until chapter 11, the end of last week's Parsha, when God kind of summarizes, V'ata Yisrael ma Hashem Elokecha shoel me'imach, ki im liyirat Adonai Elohecha, lalechet b'chol drachav, ulehava oto, v'lavod et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'chol nafshecha. Now I want to point out to you, notice a little bit of the structure of the Bible here. Chapter 6, which is, so to speak, building on the Aseret HaDibrot, which started with Ahava, with La'ovei, Lo'havai, Lushomrei mitzvotai, to those who love. We then explained what Ahava was. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, b'chol levav, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol miodecha, etc., etc. It talks about Ahava, Ahava, Ahava. Notice the Shema does not talk about Yirat Hashem, whether you want to translate it as fear of God or reverence for God, but it doesn't use that terminology. So it starts with Ahava. It then continues. When we get to chapter 8, you'll notice Parshat Ekev, which we started, at the end of chapter 7, which starts Parshat Ekev, which we read last week. V'haya Ekev tishmutam shmarat nasitam tam b'shamar Hashem lecha tabrit v'tachesed, and God will love you, etc., etc. Don't be afraid of the nations, but rather you shall destroy the avodah zarah, remember God. And in that context, it's interesting. In the next chapter, in chapter 8, remember that God took care of you, etc., etc. And then it says, ba, 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 ba. V'shamarta et mitzvot Hashem Elokecha lech b'derchav u'liyir'ah oto. The introduction of the theme of yir'ah. So we started with ahava in chapter 6, love of God. We continued into yir'ah, fear of God, reverence for God. In the middle of, smack in the middle, the Parsha has Parshat Ekev has 110 psukim. Pasuk 54, smack in the middle. V'ata Yisrael ma Hashem Elokecha doresh otcha, ki im liyir'ah et Hashem Elokecha lech b'lecha u'lahava oto. So we started with Ahava, we went to Yira, we continue with Yira, but then we conjoin Yira and Ahava, which of course has echoes of the Shema. We continue to come back to the foundational statements of the Shema. We continue in this way, and then we get to chapter 11, and we close with just ahava, v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, v'shamarta, etc., etc. And then we get to the second paragraph of Shema. V'haya im shama tishmo mitzvotai, asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom, li'ahavat Hashem Elokechem, u'la'avdo b'chol levavchem b'chol nafshechem. The second paragraph of Shema begins the same way the first paragraph of Shema starts. No yir'ah. And that's basically the way, and it ends with once again, כי אם שמור תשמור את כל המצווה הזאת, אשר אנוכי מצווה אתכם לעשותה, לאהבת ה' אלוהיכם וללכת בכל דרכיו ולדבקה בו. So basically, what we did is we started with Ahava, we went to Yira, we went back, in the middle there's Yira and Ahava, and in the end we envelope it with Ahava, Ahavat Hashem. In the section from chapter 5, 6, through chapter 10, 11, we basically have the ekronot, the foundational structure of all of the mitzvot. And that's what the rabbis in their genius did. What do we do every day? In the morning and at night, we envelop the day with, we start with Shema, Shema Yisrael Shema Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and then in chapter 11, we say V'haya im shamoa. We conjoin these two passages. What we're really doing is bookending. What we're really doing, but we don't have enough time to say chapter 6 and chapter 7 and chapter 9, 8 and chapter 9 and chapter 10 and chapter 11. So what we're really doing is symbolically saying, we affirm before we go out into the world, the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema is the mitzvah to affirm the foundational structure of Judaism, love of God, reverence for God, not to forget God, not to make a covenant with any other God. Remember the land of Israel, not to get haughty and arrogant because you get the land of Israel. All these foundational, remember that God looks at the land of Israel. Remember that you're supposed to keep the covenant in order to keep the land of Israel. That's chapter 5, 6, and 10, 11. The first Yechidah. And now we get to Parshat Re'eh. Parshat Re'eh, in a certain sense, is the coda, the beginning of Parshat Re'eh is the coda to this. Because what do we start with Parshat Re'eh, our Parsha? We start Re'eh Anochi Noten Lechem Hayom Biracha U'Klala. So the foundational ekronot of the mitzvot are then coded, are then completed with, I have now put before you a blessing and a curse. Et habracha asher tishmua mitzvot Hashem Elokechem asher anochi mitzvah etchem, v'haklala im lo tishmua mitzvah. So this is what I would call the blessing and the curse on chapter 5 through 11, through the foundational statements. And notice there's the theme of bracha and klala, that you have a choice. Do you want to accept the foundational statements or not? This is the blessing. But notice there's no detail because these are fundamental principles. And so it doesn't go into the detail of the blessings or the curse. And it says, notice here, Vayaki v'yacha Hashem Elokecha la'aretz asher ata v'shama l'rishta v'natat et habracha l'har grizim v'taklala l'har eival. It mentions in passing that this blessing and this curse is going to be in these places, but it doesn't go into detail. All of a a sudden, chapter 12, we begin, notice that we start again. Even though in chapter 5, it already said, Shema Yisrael et hachukim et hamishpatim. Listen to the mitzvot. All of a sudden, it sounds like it has to start again. Why does it have to start again? Why does it have to start again with the mitzvot in chapter 12? Eila hachukim asher shemul asot. Why do you have to start again? Because we're now going into the detailed mitzvot. We're no longer sticking with the ekronot, with the general principles. We're focusing on the details. Because as everybody knows in life, in any relationship, you have to have broad values, broad underpinnings, love, loyalty, etc. But you also have to show it in details in everyday life. I always like to, you could stop sharing for a second. I always like to tell the story that I heard from one of my teachers and friends, Rabbi Avi Weiss, was very fond of always telling the story that when he was younger, his father made aliyah at a certain point and in his rabbinate, in Rabbi Weiss's rabbinate. And when he would come back from Israel, he would make it a point. Rabbi Avi Weiss, would make it a point to pick him up at the airport, and that was an important thing. And he would always try to pick him up at the airport, unless something was unavoidable. And that once he said that, he was very busy in the shul or some pressing matter, wasn't life or death, whatever. And his father called him up and said, Avi, I'm coming, whatever, at 8 o'clock in the morning. If please pick me up at the airport. So Avi said, Abba, I love you so much. I love you so much, but I have a meeting and it's very hard for me to come at that time. I love you so much, Abba, but I can't come. So his father said, don't love me so much and just show up. Show up at the airport. That's much more of an expression of love sometimes than, sending someone a bouquet of flowers or a nice card is very nice, but it's the brass tacks. Are you there when a person needs you that often expresses love? And anybody that's, in a marriage and a relationship knows how much that's true. So if we come back to the text, so from chapter 12 on, we have the details of the mitzvot. And here too, you can divide, Parshat Re'eh, deals with the mitzvot of the centralization, and I'll talk about that if I have a few minutes, the centralization of the religious practice in Eretz Yisrael. Parshat, Shoftim is going to talk about the national institutions. They're going to talk about things like the Sanhedrin, the court, the monarchy, the prophecy, the leadership. And when you get to Parshat Kitetse and Kitavo, then you're already dealing with the interpersonal mitzvot of everyday life, not of the national institutions, but on the day-to-day nitty-gritty Hashavas Aveda, Tzedakah, etc., which every person has to deal with, etc. But what you have here, of course, from chapter 12 until chapter 26 is the second chativa, the second section of the mitzvot. And again, it's not by chance that right after that, it's followed by a section of brachot and klalot, by the setting up of the system in Har Grizim. It's mamish parallel. Chapter 5 to 11 is the section of the ekronot shel ha-mitzvot, the foundations of the mitzvot, which is then, coded with discussion, a very short discussion of bracha, klala, choice. You have a choice to make. Do you want life? Do you want death? And presented to you in Har Grizim and Har Eval. Very short. Then we have the more expansive, detailed mitzvot from chapter 11, middle of 11 to chapter 12 to chapter 26, which is then coded again with a much more lengthy presentation of the brachot. So it's A, B, A, B, in the same way, again, highlighting these two sections of, of the Torah. So that's where we start Parshat Re'eh. Parshat Re'eh is a kind of hinge where we've kind of ended the section of the foundational units, and we move to the section of the details of the mitzvot. Once we get into the beginning, what interestingly enough does it begin the chukim mishpatim in the detail? It of course talks about what is the way to worship God. What is the ideal way to worship God when we get to the nitty gritty? It's interesting, of course, that many have pointed out that in contrast, let's say, to Sefer Vayikra, where there's so much talk about korbanot, the book of Devarim does not spend a lot of time about korbanot, but it does introduce very explicitly and expands on something that is just mentioned in passing in Sefer Shmot. In Sefer Shmot, in the book of Exodus, right? So the Bible, at the end of what we call the Shirat Hayam, the end of the song at the sea, so there's this prophetic statement that God will bring us in to v'emo v'tita'emo b'har nachalatcha. God will bring us, because again, they're not yet, they just crossed the Red Sea, but God will bring us to his mountain of inheritance. Machon l'shivtecha pa'alta Adonai, the place where you will dwell. Mikdash Adonai konu yadecha, the sanctuary that God will establish, that your hands have established. So there's a hint to the idea that not only will the Jewish people experience God's presence in a Mishkan, in the desert, a place where God chooses to dwell, his and come and speak to the people. But there's a hint, but it's only a hint in the book of Exodus that there's also going to be a more permanent place, machon l'shivtecha, place where God will yoshev, literally sit. Well, God will not just come and speak, but God dwells in some way, and also a mikdash. It's a holy place. Devarim introduces a couple of important caveats, shaping of this idea that God has a place where when the Jewish people enter the land and get settled, God also symbolically enters with them and also gets settled. But it's very clear that first, the Bible says you have to destroy the Avodah Zarah, you have to destroy the paganism, because if you leave it there, it will just crop up again and again, which of course we know from the history of Tanakh was exactly what happened, that it infiltrated into all quarters of Jewish society. It was such a dominant ethos, and a kind of pure monotheism was something so radical that many people just couldn't live with it, and they kind of had a kind of Pascal's wager of covering all their bases. And the introduction, of course, here is the idea that instead of having avodah zarah, your gods all over the place, the theme here, abeid tabdun et kol hamekomot asher avdu sham, v'nitatzem et mizbechotam, lo tasu kein el Hashem lokechem. Do not worship God in all these various places, which was very common. Makes total sense. A polytheistic society would not limit or would not try to limit the service of God to one place. In contrast, a more monotheistic attitude points to certainly the value of centralization. Centralization is positive from a monotheistic point of view for a number of reasons. One reason is you can control better the worship there. If it's in one specific place under the watchful eye of the guardians of the covenant, you can hopefully make sure that it's a pure monotheism rather than a kind of syncretism where you kind of mix all kinds of religions together. Number two, it also symbolically is a statement that there's one God who, not many little gods, the God of the Galil and the God of the Negev and the God of the Arava and the God of the Mount of the Golan and the God of Lebanon, but there's one God who then projects over the whole world. And therefore, you have this idea of centralization when you're going to worship God and do the mitzvot. But again, that's one caveat. The second caveat is that it's very important that there not be a misunderstanding that when we create a place for God in this world, that we don't go so far as to believe that God actually dwells in a specific place, which limits God's omnipotence and universality. And so, therefore, notice very carefully the language the Bible uses. You should come and worship God. And first of all, it's not chosen by the human being, it's chosen by God. Number two, this is the place, Lasumet Shemo Sham, the place where God places his name. It's not that God himself lives in this place, because that borders on the pagan, but rather this is the place which God has chosen to make his name, so to speak, known there. It's the place where God puts his name, and the name here, of course, means his representation. It's something that this is the place where you can, so to speak, connect with God. Etc., etc. This is the place where you come and bring what God wants. And this idea is made, of course, very explicit in the book of Kings. In the book of Kings, and with that we can stop sharing here. Let me just in the book of Kings, in the book of Kings, if you remember when King Solomon builds the temple, so King Solomon asks the conundrum, the theological conundrum: is it possible that God, who is beyond time, beyond space, Hashamayim u'shmei Hashamayim lo yichalkelucha, the very heavens can't contain you, and yet how can this house contain you? And the answer that Shlomo gives there, if you remember from the book of Kings, is the temple is fundamentally a place of prayer. It's not a place where, so to speak, God actually dwells. It's a place which human beings will focus their attention, and God will focus God's attention and be more, so to speak, again, this is all kavayachol, as if God will be more attentive there because you've made an effort to try to reach out to God there. That's the place where God, it's a place where God is, so to speak, more willing to listen, if you want to use kind of simplistic terminology. But it's not a place where God actually dwells, because the place where actually dwells, that was the mistake of the Jews in the book of Yirmiyahu, who they said God would not destroy the temple. Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem, Heichal Hashem. God dwells in the temple. And how could God destroy his own house? Nobody destroys their own house. Again, a very paganistic conception. But it's not the place. It's the place where God, and Yirmiyahu uses the terminology of Devarim there. In chapter 7 of the book of Yirmiyahu, he says, this is the place which God places his name. And this is what you've done to it. It's not a place where God lives. It's a place where God's name is. It's a place of focus, a place where God chooses to focus and symbolically listen more to you. And it's a place, therefore, it has its holiness. So that's the beginning of Parshat Re'eh. It's the beginning of the section of the specific mitzvot, which begins with the best way to serve God, in contrast to the pagans, in contrast to a paganistic, mechanistic way of viewing the world. And from that, we then continue into many other mitzvot in Parshat Re'eh, which have to do with Makom Asher Yivchar Hashem, including the end of the parsha, which is all about the holidays, but again, about the holidays, not from the perspective of korbanot, and not from the perspective even of mitzvot. There's no mention of lulav and esrog, etc. It's the perspective of aliyah l'regel. It's to come and interact and be in the presence of God. Hamakom asher yir'eh, the mitzvah of aliyah l'regel, which is the focus of the end of Parshat Re'eh. Okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you this evening. Put Parshat Re'eh in the context of all of Sefer Dvarim. Again, as I said, if this was all known to everybody, well, I'm sorry. It was just a review. But if review is also good, to review and make sure that we see things on a pshat level in terms of what's actually going on. So I wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. Again, we hope to, some good news from Israel. It's very hard these days, and hopefully we will hear good news. Mir Tzashem.
Thank you, Rav Nadi. You know, ain't Beit Midrash B'li Chidush,
Okay.
as our rabbis say. You always learn. First of all, I don't know why you think. I mean, we do Parshat Re'eh once a year. So unless it comes up.
No, I didn't know if maybe last week the teacher who taught
No,
maybe
no
focused
one
on it.
yet has given really. This is the fourth week of Dvarim. I don't think any of the speakers have
Okay.
spoken about an overview
Okay.
the same way. Yeah, people have mentioned, yes, of course, this. Yeah, I mean, in general senses, but
Okay.
but the specific.
Okay.
I mean, I spoke about some of that on my podcast, but
Right.
that's a whole different story. But
Okay.
but the Avat Hashem, that was my podcast last week. I spoke about the
Okay.
love of God, and
Beautiful.
that's what I wrote about it. And I didn't speak about it. I wrote about it. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But thank you very much. And of course, my class on the Siddur tomorrow morning, 9:15. Everybody is welcome. We'll do basically Chazarat Hashatz. We're finishing up the Shemon Esrei. We'll go a little bit on the concept of Chazarat Hashatz tomorrow. I think that'll be our main topic. And then Rabbi Leaptags begins our Elul program on Sunday morning. I've sent out some emails, and if you haven't registered yet, please do. You don't have to listen to it. You can. But
Okay.
but Rabbi Leaptag, and we have a whole bunch
Yeah,
of
I'm going to
little
eat dinner.
series
Have a
starting.
good night.
Yeah, have a good night. Have a good night.
Okay.
Okay, everybody, we look forward to learning with you. Invite a friend. Shabbat Shalom and be well, everybody. Thank you very much. Laila Tov.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.